Hi, what's up?
Hey man, how are you doing?
I'm pregnant.
Congratulations. It is
Thanks.
your, I assumed you might be, you never
I'm
know.
expecting a child soon. How have you been, Eric?
I've been pretty good. No major life updates like that, but
Yeah.
I'm glad we're back.
Yeah, season two is starting. We took about a month off, and the topic we're going to cover this time is the American Civil War.
Yes, so we've done colonial America. We did World War One, and now we're going in the middle and doing the Civil War. So where should we start?
We're going to do the American Revolution, the Civil War, and so you guys over time will gradually get a picture of American history. And we already did colonial America. And so I imagine that in the future, audiences will be able to jump between these videos that we did not chronologically do at the same time, but they can gradually get an impression of American
Yes.
history. So the what happened in America, starting with the Revolution, we get a little bit of this with the colonial video. Is America was not established to be a single country. It was established to be a coalition of these different sub-regions, being the northern, the middle, and the southern states. And
Kind of like the
America was
EU.
originally a plural, so it was these United States, or a series of independent federated states that were unified to form a single country. And so that's a big reason for why the Civil War started. But the biggest one, and this is somewhat politically controversial, but I'll explain why I do believe it, is slavery. And at the time of the American Revolution, slavery was a contentious issue, and a lot of the American leaders, including those from the South, like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, who themselves owned slaves, wanted to abolish slavery. And the reasoning for that partly is that for the 600 years between, or let's say 1,000 years between the fall of Rome and the discovery of the New World, Europe didn't practice slavery. The church had abolished slavery, and we should probably do an episode on the Atlantic slave trade in of itself at some point because that's a whole different can of worms. But Europe had abolished slavery, and then the discovery of the New World happened. And for a series of reasons, the Europeans started practicing slavery again, but it was something that was in a violation of their moral code. And if you look at the Muslim world, the Muslims had never stopped practicing slavery. So they didn't feel any moral qualms about it. And the northern states practiced slavery. Sorry, the northern states did not practice slavery, and the southern states practiced slavery. And this wasn't as much of a political issue at the time of the revolution because you had bigger issues like fighting off the British. But the founding fathers thought that slavery would naturally abolish itself because slavery actually wasn't profitable at the time of the American Revolution. And soon after the Revolution, in the early 19th century, the state of Virginia nearly abolished slavery because peacefully because they it wasn't profitable and they could tell that there were negative social impacts to it. And then what happened in 1790 was the discovery of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was actually made by a Yankee. It was this tiny little box that suddenly made the processing of cotton a lot more efficient. And then this suddenly made slavery very profitable. And that resulted in slavery growing massively. And so, interestingly, with the Industrial Revolution, you saw both the northern and the southern states grow in their own ways. And so, from the period of the American Revolution until the US Civil War, America was growing very quickly. And so, by the time of the Revolution, America was just on the East Coast. We hadn't even settled Ohio. And then in the 70 years, or 1780 to 1860, that's 80 years. In the 80 years between the American Revolution and the Civil War, America spread all the way out to the Great Plains. And it's really weird to watch how we went from just the East Coast, and then by the time we get to the Civil War, America had taken over California. We had gone out to Nebraska, Texas. Those had all become states. And the North and the South had developed in different ways, and that the South had grown at twice the speed of the North in just sheer geographic area. The South grew much faster, but the North grew faster in people and wealth. And so at the time of the American Revolution, the North and the South had equal economic size and equal population. By the time you get to the Civil War, although the South grew faster in land, the North had twice the South's population in economic size because the North industrialized. The North built these giant cities. It just grew up in density while the South grew in space. And I need to talk more about this because there's a lot of different stuff going on, but I should pause soon, is that it got to the point where there was this critical tension between the North and the South, and the North was growing fast enough in people that the North could peacefully abolish slavery without the South's consent, because the North was becoming such a large part of the population that the Northerners could just vote to abolish slavery without the Southerners' consent.
Okay, that's helpful overview. Now, how much was the conflict really all about the sort of moral issue, or were there other things kind of that the moral issue was sort of serving as a reason?
Good question. So for my personal statement, I am from Pennsylvania, which is a northern state. I live in Texas now, which is in the South. I grew up right on the Mason-Dixon line. I grew up right in the border between the North and the South. And I'm getting to this because people will say you're a damn Yankee. And I want to address those claims first. And I grew up right in the Pennsylvania-Delaware border. And I actually lived in the same town as Joe Biden for a handful of years, the town of Centerville, Delaware, where the things in Centerville, or there's a thrift shop and a diner, and Biden and I both lived a couple miles outside town. And I had ancestors who fought on both sides of the Civil War. And my dad's side were Irish immigrants at the time. My mom's side fought in the Civil War, with most of my ancestors being in Indiana, but I had some ancestors in Tennessee. And to preface, I am a Yankee, but there are some mitigating factors. And the Civil War is a really contentious issue where people debate even today whether or not it was about slavery. And I think it's one of those things where those memes where there's a bell curve and the middle of the bell curve disagrees and the smartest and the stupidest people agree? It's one of those things in the Civil War where there are multiple ways you can explain it, but on the most complicated and on the simplest level, it's about slavery. And you can get into states' rights in the middle. And a lot of people in the South really, they say it's about states' rights, which there is an element of truth to. But the reason I think it's fundamentally about slavery is that you can almost perfectly correlate slave ownership with support for the Confederacy. Where if you look at a map of the South, the parts of the South which didn't own slaves, like Appalachia or Kentucky, they supported the Union. While all the parts of the South, there wasn't a single slave-owning area that supported the Union. And this is something where people say that the victors write history, and that's true for a lot of history, and I don't really like that myth, but there are elements of truth to it. That being said, the narrative of the Civil War was actually written by the losers, where the South wrote the narrative of the Civil War for 60 years after the war in the early 20th century. And they wrote it to be at states' rights. And the element of truth there is that the South was saying the states should have the rights to choose whether or not they have slavery, which I think is constitutionally. You could talk to all the people I know who studied the Constitution said that the South actually had the constitutionally correct argument. The states did have a right to determine whether or not they owned slaves or whether or not they left the Union. And so the South said we have a state's right to own slaves, but the South also did use the federal government when it was in the interest of slavery. In that the Dred Scott case, which was a huge issue before the Civil War, where the South said, we can use the federal police to go into northern states to catch runaway slaves. So the South did hypocritically go against states' rights when it was in their self-interest. And if you were to go back to the start of the Civil War, and if you were to ask people, including President Lincoln of the North, if the Civil War is about slavery, no one would say it was about slavery because that was way too much of a hot button issue. And so people said it was about, does the South have the right to leave the Union? But the reason they were leaving the Union was the Union would abolish slavery. And by the time you get to 3 years in the war, 1863, the North had finally abolished slavery. And then the North was able to make this political cause about the Civil War about ending slavery. And so, to summarize, on the simplest and most complex levels, it was about slavery. But then, if you want to get in the level in between, it's about states' rights. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. So, you stopped yourself earlier because you wanted to make sure that we're up to speed. Now continue telling the story.
Yeah. So we gotta gradually build up to the Civil War because there's a lot of weird details that lead up to it. And as the Industrial Revolution happened, so people practiced slavery for most of human history. There are a couple exceptions like China or the European Middle Ages. And a big thing which let the North get rid of slavery was the Industrial Revolution. Because beforehand, every single task had to be done with human labor. And so if you go back to the Greeks and the Romans, Aristotle supported slavery because he said that slavery opened up educated, intelligent people to think about philosophy and political issues because they didn't have to work. And so Aristotle's one of the most respected philosophers in history. And one of the points I'd say is that I've said in previous videos is that I do not support slavery. However, the fact that most of the most advanced philosophers in history did should mean that it's an issue we should think a little bit more about. And one of the most interesting books I read is Roll, Jordan, Roll. And it's a book written by a Marxist on the philosophy of slavery. And so he goes through all the arguments the South used to justify slavery. And it's interesting where they largely pulled on ancient Greek and Roman authors, because the Greeks and the Romans practiced slavery. And so the North and the South were stuck in this critical tension where the North, we've had the Industrial Revolution. And so now that machines can do the physical work, you don't need humans to do it anymore. And so you had this tension where the country was growing really quickly and they were adding different states. And so you had the Missouri Compromise where for every free state you had to add a slave state. And so when Missouri is on the border in the North and the South, when Missouri voted to become a slave state, they had to split because Maine was a colony of Massachusetts at that point. So they had to make Maine a separate state. And so you were constantly adding these new states. And what happened was that the South realized that if things kept growing at this speed, the North could wipe them out because the North was growing so much faster. So the South kept on trying to break all these deals it made. And so for the Missouri Compromise, which was in the 1830s, the South said, okay, we can have Missouri, but everything west of Missouri will go to the North. And then the South realized if we keep this compromise, we're going to lose. The South kept on breaking all of its compromises it made with the North. And my personal opinion, having read on this topic, is the South was so insufferable for the Civil War that I feel completely vindicated in the North destroying them. And the reason I say that is that the South had just the South stopped behaving in any way that was reasonable, where there was a time where there was a debate about slavery in the U.S. Congress, where a Southern senator literally beat a Northern senator with a stick for disagreeing with him. And there was a lot of crazy parts here where there are certain eras of history that just become weird microcosms of the political issues of that era that don't make sense before or after, where there was this random Southern guy and his buddies. They tried to take over Nicaragua, named William Walker. This Southern guy and a couple other guys, they took over Nicaragua to make it an American state because the South's goal was to grow as much as possible. And so the South's ideal was they wanted to conquer like half of Mexico. They wanted to take Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Cuba, because slavery can work in tropical climates. And And so he took over Nicaragua, and then the American tycoon, William Vanderbilt, he had investments in Nicaragua. And so he hired mercenaries to fight off this southern adventurer. And this is pretty embarrassing for the Nicaraguan nation that their independence became contingent upon the ego struggles of two Americans. And there's a lot of other stories, like the Yucatan area in southern Mexico, that nearly joined America, but the North said no. In the Mexican-American War, the top third of Mexico nearly joined America. And in each of these cases, the northern states said no. We're not going to conquer Mexico or Central America because we know that those are just become slave states. And so America turned to this dysfunctional marriage in the North and the South, in which each side was purposely handicapping the other side so that the other side didn't grow faster than the other. And as this relationship got realer, both sides started to hate each other more. And so I actually think it's comparable to our era. And I've made a bunch of videos saying why I think we'll have a future civil war, which is a big reason why I decided to do this podcast now. Just the North and the South were turning into different countries, and they just couldn't even stand to look at each other. And in the South before the Civil War, they literally took Lincoln, the major Northern candidate, off the ballot. And there were all these little scares and these pivotal moments where it looked as if a civil war would happen that was just building up this tension for the big burst.
Right. And so same, I have a sense today, you came on the Moment of Zen podcast. We had a great discussion about sort of the tensions today between the left and the right. And I have a understanding both intellectually and psychographically of who are the left and who are the right. Maybe say more about who was the North and who was the South.
Yeah.
Of, what kinds of people they were, what kinds of beliefs did they have, like outside of slavery.
So I talked about in the Colonial America video how the descendants of the Civil War, the people who fought in the Civil War, the descendants of the two factions which fought in the English Civil War. This is an interesting trajectory where you can perfectly match the ancestry of the people who fought in the English Civil War to the U.S. Civil War, because the people who fought for the Parliament in the English Civil War settled the north of the country. The people who fought for the Royalists and the King in the English Civil War settled in the South. And the best way to understand it is that you have a far north and a far south, and they hated each other. The far north, or like I'd call it Yankee land. I said I was a Yankee before, but that's not actually true. The Yankees and people in Pennsylvania don't like being called the Yankees. I said that because Southerners will call everyone from the North a Yankee. But the Yankees are really a group in New England, upstate New York, Michigan, the northern tier of America from Minnesota to New England. And the Yankees were, we talked about them in the Colonial America video, they were a specific ethnic group, and they were really against slavery. And one of the things that people don't know about the U.S. Civil War, people think that the people who pushed for abolition are the same group as the woke people today. Something that people don't know is that the people who were vociferously pro-abolition were fundamentalist Christians, because they viewed slavery as an insult to God. And the other great irony is the most fundamentalist Christian part of America was New England and the northern states, the parts that are agnostic and irreligious now. And so you had this demographic of fundamentalist Christians in the northern tier of America who were violently against slavery. And abolitionists were generally disliked for the U.S. Civil War. They were seen kind of the same way where we see political radicals. And in the parts of the North that weren't Yankee, like Pennsylvania or Ohio or Illinois or whatever, they sympathized with the abolitionists, where they thought, we don't like slavery, but they thought the abolitionists were insane. And the northern part of America, this part's industrialized, and it was actually in the process of industrialization. And it was like 99% white, where the northern tier of America, it was just almost entirely white. And cities like Philadelphia or Chicago or Harlem that are black now, blacks hadn't left the South yet. And meanwhile, south of the Mason-Dixon line, the Deep South was the area that was violently for slavery, where the Upper South is like Virginia, Kentucky. That area had been in decline. they would probably not be too pissed off if slavery got canceled. And the Deep South was where it was the wealthiest part of America in number of rich people. So the North was industrially far more powerful, but most of the richest people in America were concentrated in Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia, and their economic system was based upon making cotton for industrialization. And so this was the period of the Industrial Revolution. And so Belgium, England, the northern states, they had these factories where they'd make clothing, and the clothing came from cotton that was produced in the South. And so the South's, it's interesting, the North and the South both had economies that were built off the Industrial Revolution, but in very different ways, where the Industrial Revolution made the North more urban, but it made the South more rural. And so the South's economy was only really good at one thing, and that was making cotton and other exportable resources like tobacco. And the South's plan when the Civil War started was to cut off cotton production to England and France, who were industrialized countries that required it. And they thought that Britain and France, and we'll get to why this didn't work later, would support them because they needed their cotton. What happened instead was the British just started growing cotton in India and Egypt. And the South thought they could use the export of cotton as this chip to dominate global politics, and that failed. And once you get into the Civil War, you realize the North was better at almost literally everything than the South. The South couldn't supply its own food, it couldn't make its own guns, it didn't have enough men to fight. So the South went really hard for a single economic thing, while the North was much more diversified, and that's why the North won. Spoilers, if you guys don't know. And so, to summarize, you have an insane South and a very aggressive far North. So South Carolina and Massachusetts, across all of American history, you'll never get South Carolina and Massachusetts to like each other. As a general rule, they've never been on the same page. And then you have, there's someone's doing construction nearby for the sound. But then you have, oh, that's great, Zoom. I love Riverside. And then you have a near North and a near South, where Pennsylvania, Ohio, they supported abolitionism, but they weren't as hardcore. And then you have Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. They supported the Deep South, but they, again, weren't as hardcore. And then you have the middle states that are between the North and the South that realistically could have gone either way, like Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. And those states, they were in contention in the middle of the Civil War. So again, you have these two poles where Massachusetts, New York, or Georgia, Mississippi, they were the ones who were pushing for the Civil War, and they pulled these middle states in between who didn't want to fight along with them.
Now, let's talk more about the battle or the war itself.
Yeah.
Is there worlds in which it could have been close, or is massacre?
Yeah. So the South, I was in the alternate history space for 7 years, which is what if the Nazis won the Civil War and what if the South won World War II? And so I've shadow boxed those scenarios forever. And this is one of those contentious topics because what if the South won the Civil War is one of the most popular alternate histories. And there's a great series called by Harry Turtledove about what if the South won the Civil War. I think he handles it really well, except for one detail, where he says that if the South could have won at, this will make more sense later, but there were a couple of battles where the South invaded the North, being Antietam or Gettysburg. And the North had a much better advantage in industry, in manpower, in everything. And so the South could have won in these short battles where they fought the North in their own turf. And then that would basically force the North to capitulate because the North would realize it's not worthwhile to do it. And what he thought would happen, and I agree with, is that the North and the South would become rivals and they'd fight each other in World War I. But then as time would pass, the North's industrial advantage would grow larger, so the North would crush the South in World War I. And I think the North would have just reconquered the South. He thought there'd be another World War II. I think he did that because he wanted to sell another 5 books in his series. Um, and 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 so I agree with that. But to get, and also if something we agree on is that if the South won the Civil War, then the Germans would have won the world wars because America wouldn't have been able to intervene in Europe or Asia in the world wars. But the actual war started when the 1860 presidential election, where President Buchanan, so you have the Democratic Party, and the Democrats were the party of the South at that point, and the Republicans were just developing as a party because the Whig Party fell apart, and the Republicans were the party of the North. And so, right before the Civil War, the Democrats had total electoral dominance of America, where the Democrats were the only party, and the Republicans came into existence to counterbalance the dominance of the Democrats. But you had Buchanan, Buchanan was the president right before the Civil War, and he and Biden are the only two presidents from Pennsylvania. And I'm from Pennsylvania. And so it's funny that our only two Pennsylvanian presidents, and Pennsylvania is one of the most important states in American history, are considered our two worst presidents ever. And they're both people of Celtic ancestry who I would say came in right before civil wars because Pennsylvania is a culturally in between the Midwest, the Appalachia South, and the Northeast. So when you want a politically non-controversial figure when your society's falling apart, you pick a Pennsylvanian. And so Buchanan was part of the Democrats, so he was stuck in this kind of useless situation where the South was about to secede, and he was sympathetic to the South. And at the same time, though, him supporting the South was supporting the destruction of the country of which he was president. So you have Buchanan being this weak president, and Buchanan was giving aid to the South. He was letting the South arm. He was letting the South be ridiculous. And then the Democratic Party split into three, and the Democrats couldn't unify. And so what that resulted in is that the South was split electorally. And then Abraham Lincoln, the Republican president, was able to win all the North. And so what happened was that the North was unified under a single candidate. There was not a single Southern state that voted for Lincoln. And so the South saw, wait, this Northern president who's running on an abolish slavery platform won without a single Southern state. He's going to abolish slavery. We need to secede now. And so what started happening was that the Southern states said, we're going to form the Confederate States of America. And the first state to secede was South Carolina, followed by the states of the Deep South. And then it started getting more contentious, where the point where the Confederacy needed to recruit Virginia and the states of the Upper South, because Virginia was the most populous and powerful state in the South. But also Virginia wasn't as hardcore as the states further south. And so the Confederacy had to put its capital in Richmond, the capital of Virginia, as a way to recruit Virginia to fight for the Confederacy. But then the problem that ran into is that Richmond is 100 miles from Washington, D.C. So the Confederates put their capital pretty close to the Union's borders. And something that's indicative of the Confederacy was that Richmond was the only city that was large enough and developed enough to actually be the capital of the Confederacy, which is depressing because it shows how the South had such a rural and undeveloped society. And this created a crux and issue for the rest of the war, that the capital of the Confederacy was only 100 miles away from the capital of the Union, being Washington, D.C. And so the entirety of the U.S. Civil War, or like 70% of it, was the Confederacy and the Union fighting over those 100 miles between their two capitals.
Yeah. That's a great overview. Now let's say more about, unless you want to bring us back to the present, but I'm tempted to go to the aftermath.
We have to actually cover the war.
Okay, so let's go detail on the war itself.
Yeah, so we have to get to the battles and stuff. So the first conflict was Fort Sumter, in which there's this fort outside of Charleston, South Carolina, where South Charleston, South Carolina was the first city to rebel in the South, and Fort Sumter was the fort outside of it. And then the Union had to evacuate the fort, and this was the first battle that signified that the war had started. And so neither side was ready when the U.S. Civil War started, and it took 6 months for both sides just to gather their armies because the U.S. at this time period didn't have a real military, and or it was incredibly small compared to what it is today. So the first battle of the war was Bull Run, where the Union gathered its men and they marched right outside of Washington, D.C. And then the Confederates beat the Union's forces. And you can look at the U.S. Civil War as two different fronts because there's the Eastern Front, which is Washington, D.C. to Richmond in the state of Virginia. And then you had the Western Front, which was Tennessee, Missouri, Mississippi, South Carolina. And what happened was that the Confederates did much better on the Eastern Front than the Western Front. And so the Confederates had much better leadership than the North in the Eastern Front, led by Virginians, while the North dominated the South in the Western Front. And so there was largely stasis on the Eastern Front, while on the Western Front, the North was able to push the South down. And what ended up happening was that the Western Front hooked back around to attack the Eastern Front. And let's go to the Western Front first, and then we're going to jump to the Eastern Front. The first battle the North fought against the South was Shiloh, down in Tennessee, where the North was able to push down, beat the Confederates at Shiloh, take the western half of Tennessee, while the eastern half stayed Confederate. The irony, though, is the western half of Tennessee was Confederate supporters, while the eastern half was Union supporters. The Confederates took their half of the state that didn't like them, and the Union took the western part of the state that did like the Confederacy. And a great irony of this war is that the North had total dominance of the sea lanes around the Confederacy. So the North was actually able to attack places in the deep south of the Confederacy the first. So the North took parts of Florida, it took New Orleans, took Mobile, because it could attack the waterways around the Confederacy. And so the North's big goal was to take the rivers that unified the Confederacy and the railroads, where the South had very few. The South only had a handful of railroads, where the North was just completely crisscrossed in railroads because the North was much better developed. So the North needed to take these different rail junctions to occupy the South and the rivers. Because the South was lightly populated, if the North could control the rivers and the railroads, they can control the giant geographic region that is the Confederacy. And the Confederate States of America is larger than Western Europe. And so it's shocking because, and a great irony as well, is that more Americans died in the U.S. Civil War than every other war in American history combined, including the World Wars. Partly because it's two sides of Americans fighting each other, so both people dying are Americans. But also, America's greatest enemy is itself, in that America has done a very good job militarily in its history, but the greatest enemy we've had to fight are ourselves. And there are certain battles in the U.S. Civil War where a third of the men die, which is, if you know military history, that's completely unheard of. Because in most wars, like 5%, 10% die. In the technology in the U.S. Civil War, people were trying to fight a much older war than really what made sense, where people were using technology from 60 years earlier in the Napoleonic Wars, but military technology became much more advanced in the time in between. So there was this lag. And so in previous times, people would use muskets, and they'd reload the muskets. It would take a long time. By the U.S. Civil War, you started getting these repeating rifles that can fire 7 rounds without having to reload, and the earliest machine guns were used in the U.S. Civil War. So the previous tactics that relied off muskets just ended up killing a third of an army in the U.S. Civil War, and tens of thousands of people would die in individual battles. And the Civil War is a war where I respect how both sides fought. The North and the South fought very bravely, and the South had a stronger warrior culture. So the Southerners thought that we can just beat the North militarily because we're braver and we're manlier, and that didn't happen. Where the North fought very well, and it's crazy to read about a war fought not that long ago, where the U.S. Civil War, it's only 150 years away. In the long scheme of history, that's not that far. People who aren't that different from us today were facing these horrifying battles that killed a tremendous amount of people. And the U.S. Civil War should have been a warning to Europe with World War I, because there weren't that many wars in the 100 years between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I. And the U.S. Civil War was one of them. And so tactics changed a lot over the course of the U.S. Civil War, where in the beginning, it was these giant blocks of men, much like the earlier wars, marching up to each other and firing. And then by the end of the war, you had trench warfare like World War I. You had people changing their military formations to be more less rigid. And so you could view the U.S. Civil War as one of the very first modern wars, because it was one of the first wars fought by an industrialized society. Before I continue, do you have any questions?
No, I'm
okay. Yeah. And so for the Western campaign, the North's goal was to split the Mississippi, because the Mississippi is America's big river, and the South needed the Mississippi to trade, because it's where most of the South's just transport went, where the U.S. first seized the port of New Orleans in Louisiana, which was the South's biggest city, and then it tried to force its way up the Mississippi River. And I'm not saying the war chronologically, I'm doing it by front, which, if you're a Civil War buff, this might annoy you somewhat, but it's a way to explain it to people who don't know the war very well. Where in 1863, at the Battle of Vicksburg, the South had this fortification in this bend in the river in Mississippi, and the North spent a very long time besieging Vicksburg, where the commander at that battle was... So the North's two best commanders were Grant and Sherman. Both of them are from the Western Front. The North cycled through all these useless commanders in the Eastern Front. And I have admiration for Lincoln, because Lincoln kept on having to burn through all of these crappy generals in the Eastern Front and keep firing them. And a man with less political drive than Lincoln would have just accepted the fourth bad commander. Hooker, McClellan, Meade. Most of these generals did not do a good job, but for whatever reason, all of the North's good commanders were in the West, and all of the South's good commanders were in the East, which is why the South was able to hold the front in the East, while the North was able to win in the West. And it's ironic that you'd think it would be easiest for the North to just walk 100 miles from Washington, D.C. to Virginia. But instead, the North was able to take the giant Western front. And after a lengthy siege, the North was able to take Vicksburg, and then that split the South in half. And the Battle of Vicksburg actually happened. The North won the Battle of Vicksburg at the exact same time as it won the Battle of Gettysburg in the East. And before we jump to the East, there was a front in Missouri as well, where Missouri, before the Civil War, actually the state of Kansas had its own Civil War, which the North won. And then as the Civil War started, the state of Missouri had its own Civil War, where the South had a lot of settlers in Missouri, and then a Union commander named Lyons recruited his own army in Missouri of mostly German immigrants, and they won the war. And so the North won its own little civil wars in Missouri and Kansas. But on the Eastern Front, I just talked at the Battle of Bull Run, which the South won. And then the Union had the commander McClellan, who's from Philadelphia. When I lived in Philly, I walked past his birthplace on the way to school. And McClellan was very good at training an army. McClellan did a great job of training the Union army to be a good force, but McClellan was terrified of actually letting his men die. And an ironic story here is McClellan was actually a supporter of slavery, but he supported the Union. And this shows that the Civil War was a more complex conflict than a lot of people think, where the top Confederate commander, Robert E. Lee, also disliked slavery, but he felt a loyalty to his home state of Virginia that overrided his loyalty to the United States. And McClellan, ironically, was the opposite. He supported slavery, but he felt a loyalty to the nation, which overrode that. And McClellan had a plan to sail down the coast of Virginia and attack Richmond, the Confederate capital, by land. And he did that, but he was such a coward, he literally did not walk his men to Virginia. And the Confederacy did a really cool trick where the Confederate commander, to show that he had more men than he did, he walked the same group of men 10 times around in a circle in front of the Union to make it appear as if he had a force many times larger than his actual force. And this scared McClellan, even though McClellan in reality had far more men than the Confederate force. And if McClellan just attacked, he could have taken Richmond, but he didn't, and so he failed. And then the Confederates were able to bring together a force to protect Richmond, so McClellan was just sitting there outside Richmond without attacking. And then Abraham Lincoln fired McClellan, brought in a couple new commanders that you don't need to know about, except for General Hooker, who Hooker became slang for a prostitute because he let there be prostitutes in the Union Army, and so that's where we got the term hooker. And then Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, realized the only way the South can win a war, because the North has far more manufacturing than us, they have far more men, is to attack the North. And so Robert E. Lee made the decision, I'm going to attack the North sideways, hook around, and then take Washington, D.C. from the North. And Robert E. Lee tried this twice because the Confederates couldn't attack Washington, D.C. through the state of Virginia because the Union's defenses on the Maryland-Virginia border, where Washington, D.C. is, were too strong. So Lee attacked twice around the North. And those are the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg, which are the two biggest battles of the war. And so Antietam was when the Confederates were attacking through Maryland. And this is one of the points that changed history, where the Confederates would have probably won, but then one of the Confederate commanders, one of the Confederate soldiers dropped the battle plans on the ground, and McClellan had been reinstated by Abraham Lincoln by that point. And McClellan found the Confederate battle plans. He found what they were going to do, and so he put himself in the right position where they could defeat the Confederacy. And Antietam was a close battle that Confederates lost. And it's ironic, for the first few years of the war, the North won almost all of the battles on its turf in Maryland or Pennsylvania, and the South won almost all of the battle on its turf in Virginia. So Antietam's the first point the South could have won the Civil War. Then Robert E. Lee tried it again with the Battle of Gettysburg, where he did the same strategy into Pennsylvania. And Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle in American history. It happened at the exact same day as the North winning Vicksburg. And after a giant battle in southern Pennsylvania, the North finally beat the South. And Gettysburg was a multi-day battle. And an interesting point is that cavalry armies would just attack around the other side's positions in the U.S. Civil War. And so the Confederate cavalry was just raiding Pennsylvania, and the Confederate cavalry happened to not be there at the Battle of Gettysburg because the commander was just too busy having fun. And so the Confederates not having, again, another point where the war nearly changed, the Confederates just happened to not have their cavalry. And the Union cavalry would also raid deep into the South, where you'd have these cavalry armies that would just attack deep into enemy territory. And there was a Confederate cavalry force that just raided deep into Ohio for no real reason. And after the Battle of Gettysburg is the last point the South could have won the Civil War, where 1863, the war is 1860 to 1865. 1863 was the last point the South could have won, and the North really got its crap together past that point. And the thing if the South had won one of those battles, the British and the French were considering joining and helping the Confederacy. But the British had their own war going on in China, and the French were trying to conquer Mexico. So the British and the French were having their own issues, but they both told each other that if the South won a victory like Gettysburg, they would have supported the Confederacy. And if Britain and France supported the Confederacy, the Union would probably have to give up. But After 1863, Abraham Lincoln put General Grant in charge of the Eastern Front. So taking this general from the Western Front in the East, and then Grant just started hammering the South. And so from that period onwards was the North just gradually crushing the South. And one of the North's top generals had this thing called the Anaconda Plan at the start of the war, which was to strangle the South through using blockades of the South's ports, because the North had an overwhelming naval advantage over the South, cutting the Mississippi in half and then crushing the South like a giant anaconda. And everyone thought that was lame because they wanted to just walk and march into the South. But then over time, the Anaconda Plan is what the North actually did do. So we talked before about splitting the Mississippi and blockading the ports. And so the second part of it was that General Sherman, who was the right-hand man of General Grant when he was on the Western Front. And when Grant was put on the Eastern Front, Sherman became the main leader of the Western Front. He wanted to cut the South right in half. And so he attacked the rail junction at Chickamauga and Chattanooga in eastern Tennessee. And this is one of the biggest battles of the war. And it's the biggest battle in the Western theater, where the North was able to secure the rail junction that unified the Confederacy at Chickamauga, and that split the South in half. So the Western and the Eastern parts of the Confederacy lost the ability to talk to each other because it was split in half. And then Sherman did his march to the sea, and armies of this time period were dependent upon rail junctions and rail transports. And Sherman said, nah, screw that. I'm just going to steal from the local South. And so Sherman marched across the state of Georgia, cutting the Confederacy in half by just taking resources from the local Georgians. And the South whines a lot about this, where they say, oh my God, why did the North steal resources from us or burn various towns? And I personally am not sympathetic, because the U.S. Civil War is one of the most humanely fought wars in history. Even the worst things in the U.S. Civil War are more humane than 98% of wars in human history. But what happened was that he cut his way across Georgia, and then Sherman went north against Virginia. And so he circled back to North Carolina, and the eastern front of the war was now surrounded. And Lee had been able to do a good job of holding off the eastern front in Virginia, but then with another Northern army coming up from North Carolina, he couldn't do it. And the North was pushing the South down Virginia. And then the war devolved into trench warfare, where there were these various lines in Virginia that were very difficult to cross. And for example, you had the siege of Petersburg, which was trench warfare, and you had a fascinating battle called the Battle of the Wilderness, which is there's this area of barren forest in eastern Virginia that I've been to, and both sides just lit the forest on fire. So you had this giant battle in the middle of a burning forest. And after that point, the South was surrounded, and it basically ran out of guys, and the South capitulated the war.
Dude,
explaining the Civil War speed run.
Your recall of these events is incredible. Oh my God.
Thank you.
Wow. What have we not covered in context of Civil War on this topic?
That's basically it. We covered the whole war. We can move on to the aftermath now.
Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah. So the South was crushed, and I saw these statistical analyses that looked at the North and the South of the Civil War, and a big reason was that you saw elite over competition, where America was a wealthy country at this point, and so the average American wasn't starving, but America was having a tremendous amount of competition for good jobs. And so that was the North and the South's elite competing for economic dominance. And so there was a lot of elite competition without the public being starving. And what happened was the North just crushed the South. And the North abolished slavery. They abolished slavery at half the way through the war with the 16th Amendment. And that just killed the South's economy, because the South's economy was totally dependent upon slavery. And so an equivalent, let's say, for our society to the South abolishing slavery. Imagine you abolished a corporation. Imagine you liquidate every single corporation in America today. And so you just ripped out the entire South's economy. And I personally support that decision. I think it was good that we abolished slavery. Um, but it did put the South through a century of soul searching, where the South from 1860 to 1960, after the Civil War, it became the poorest region of the country. The South enforced Jim Crow, which was their racist anti-black segregation policies. And so the South went through a period of decline. And over the last 60 years, the South has since learned its lesson. And now the South is the wealthiest and fastest growing region of America. But for the century after the U.S. Civil War, it was the Rust Belt. The area that's now the Rust Belt totally dominated America. And my home state of Pennsylvania, as an example, the Civil War was great for Pennsylvania because it let all the arms manufacturing for the South was done in states like Pennsylvania or Ohio or New York. At the time of the Civil War, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York were a third of the entire country's population. And so cities like Chicago, New York, or Philadelphia colonized the rest of the country. And the North became an incredibly, the Northern Industrial Rust Belt colonized the rest of the country. And then the North used the Civil War to just completely populate the West, because before the Civil War, the North and the South was caught in this junction of oh my God, we made a free state then a slave state, and so we have to keep balance. The North was during the Civil War and afterwards like, no, we're going to populate the entire West. And so the period of the Wild West started with the U.S. Civil War, and the North made the Homestead Act, which is basically, you want to populate Nebraska, Kansas, Nevada, just take the land and you can have it. And they didn't do that before the Civil War because that scared the South because it would involve so much free labor settling the West. And a big reason for the Civil War that I didn't touch on is that you can't populate most of America with slaves. Nevada, New Mexico, Kansas, it just doesn't, you can't use slavery because it just doesn't work for the climate. So the South realized that if the North kept expanding west, the South wouldn't survive. And also the North then built the Transcontinental Railway during the Civil War because the South was trying to block the North from building the railroad because they knew that if there was a railroad from California to Kansas, it would just be populated by Northerners. And so with the end of the Civil War, the South went into a century of decline, and the North had to militarily occupy the South, and we can talk about Reconstruction. But the North militarily occupied the South for 20 years. The South went through a century of decline. The Rust Belt took over the country, and then America populated the West. And in the century after the Civil War was the century of America's great growth, because we destroyed the dissent inside our nation, where we didn't have to deal with the South anymore, and so the North could lead the country into industrialization, the world wars, a century of dominance. And so the end of the Civil War set up America to become the great superpower that it is. And I'm grateful that the South lost, because if the South won, the North and the South would just keep fighting each other, and America would not become the great country that it is.
Is it worth getting into Reconstruction in this episode?
Yeah, I'll spend we've got 5 minutes. So Lincoln got shot, and he, an angry Southerner didn't like that he won, and so John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln. And I think that's sad, because I think if the North had kept doing Reconstruction, we'd live in a better world. Because the North had a policy of, we want to split up the slave plantations among the blacks. And they had a policy of 20 acres and a mule. And I think that would have worked out better, because you would have developed this black middle class based off owning property. And instead, what happened was that I was going to say Biden, Lincoln's vice president was a Southerner, and Lincoln never meant his vice president to seize power. He meant it as I'm going to put this Southerner who I don't really like as my vice president so that I can ease the transition of the conquest of the South. And what happened instead was you had this Southerner who was pro-slavery in charge of the process of the reintegration of the South. And so Johnson didn't go hard enough. And so what you ended up with was that you kept the South's previous class structure where you had a small, wealthy elite keep blacks as serfs. And so blacks started to work on the cotton plantations again. And it was kind of this halfway house. And the North made a deal with the South that you guys can reinstitute Jim Crow, you can reinstitute these racist policies because we don't want to have to militarily occupy you. Because America was whatever anarcho-libertarians want today is what America was at the time of the U.S. Civil War. There was no income tax. There was we were based off the gold standard. There were no regulatory bodies. I mean, sounds great, but jump off that point. The North didn't want to have to pay for the military occupation of the South. And so the North said, hey, you guys can go back to oppressing black people if we don't have to conquer you. And so that's what Reconstruction was about.
Should we end on that uplifting note?
Yeah.
Well, this was a fantastic overview of what led up to the Civil War itself, and some of the aftermath. And glad we're on to season 2 and excited for more overviews coming soon.
Great. See you next week with The Rise of Rome.
Perfect.
Sorry, everybody. I forgot to add the recommended reading list in the actual recording of this video, so I'm going to throw this on at the end. James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom is the best overview. If you want something longer, Shelby Foote's trilogy on the Civil War is very widely respected, and Bruce Catton has his own trilogy as well as a summary, which is These Hallowed Grounds. So check out those authors if you want to read more. Peace.